A breath of sea fog moves through the ruined colonnade like a living thing. Diver lights cut through the green water and find stone faces half sunken, eyes of basalt and marble watching the slow passing of fish. Beneath the surf, something hums in the bones of the city, not sound, exactly, but a sensation, as if the stones remember a voice. No one knows why the masonry here resists the scrub of salt and tide while nearby walls crumble to talc and mud. At first light, the island looks like an island out of memory, scrubbed volcanic black, a single ruined bell tower leaning inland, gulls making arcs of white overhead. On shore, nets drip and a fisherman points to a reef of broken pillars beyond the breakers. He uses a word the old people still say, a word that sounds like a sigh, and then turns away. Pronunciation/salam/. The drowned ring. Dives begin with small rituals. Equipment is tested, breath counted, the slate is clipped to the wrist. The lead diver, a woman in her late 30s with a gray ponytail and deliberate hands, taps once on her tank and gives the signal. She does not speak much, because the sea takes language and gives back only its own strange, echoing grammar. The first architecture that appears is not a temple in any orthodox sense but a ring of carved plinths, a circular plaza half buried in silt. The carvings are concentric bands of sigils, repeated like the teeth of a gear, and every band seems to be cut to fit something that is no longer there. If you stand now at the edge where land becomes ruin, what would you believe? Would you see human hands and ordinary tools, or would the mind want to fill the empty spaces with something else? The enigma deepens not with what is present but with what has been wrought to be missing. On dry land, local lore fills the gaps in a way that is not mere fantasy. An old woman in the village recites a line that begins, "They took the circle into the sea and left the mark." She says it with the laconic certainty of someone who has seen tides take more than boats. Her phrase is an authority of a kind, not lab-certified, but stamped by decades of looking and remembering. The stone here is not ordinary limestone. It rings when struck with a brass rod, a clear, bell-like tone that hangs in the air. Under a hand lens, the matrix shows tiny globules of a glassy mineral fused into the grain, as if the stone has drunk fire and cooled. The diver who first sampled the plinths remembers the weight as uncanny. It feels denser than one expects, as if density itself had been compressed into meaning. What could have melted stone in such a way without leaving vitrified slag? There are scientific possibilities. Localized lightning strikes preserved by ancient weather conditions, or kiln-like hearths used in metallurgical processes, but none fits neatly here. The measurements do not make sense. Thermal profiles on the outer surfaces suggest exposure to intense heat for a short time, yet organic residues show that the same surfaces were underwater within decades. Lasers Can Survey, 2019. A team of archaeologists arrives with graph paper notebooks and instruments that look like the tools of astrologers. Magnetometers drift across the seabed like obedient fish, and a drone with a bathymetric sensor sketches the contours of the plaza in pale blue. Photogrammetry stitches imagery into a virtual ruin that can be walked with a mouse. But when theories are offered, each seems to gather more questions than answers. Perhaps this circle was a necropolis, a place of burial where ships laid down offerings. Perhaps it was a calendrical device, an enormous clock that used shadow and wave to mark sacred events. Some fringe suggestion offers astronomical alignment with constellations now shifted by axial precession. The carved teeth could align with the star that shone brightest some 5,000 years ago. The mainstream counters with radiocarbon dates from marine incrustation that place human activity much later. Which theory holds? The enigma deepens. The first night back on land, the team gathers over maps. Names are argued over, the ones given by old sailors and the ones given by survey grids. A postdoc scrolls through a set of high-resolution images and stops on a small panel of sigils that repeat, but never quite the same. He says quietly, "It's like they were copying, but each copy becomes an error." It is the kind of sentence that invites metaphors, deliberate degradation to avoid exact replication, a coded variation to foil the casual reader. In the village, a child draws one of the sigils onto a scrap of paper with a stick of charcoal. The mark is crude, but its rhythm is unmistakable, a central dot, a clockwise spiral, a three-pronged fork at the outer edge, like a map folded in on itself. The child knows nothing of photogrammetry or thermoluminescence. The child's hand only remembers, and memory has its own authority. Days of survey turn into weeks of argument. A conservator finds traces of pigments, red ochre and a blue that dissolves under common solvents, a compound the lab cannot immediately identify. It fluoresces under ultraviolet like a living thing. A materials specialist suggests a pigment derived from a shell dye, but the composition includes trace elements typical of volcanic glass. Analytical Chemistry ICP-MS, 2021. A second site appears downcurrent, a corridor sealed by a slab that seems to have been cast, not carved. Its surface bears the same concentric sigils but without the chisel marks that would betray a human artisan. The slab is heavier than anyone predicted. They winch it up with a block and tackle, and when it tilts, the salt water inside the chamber exhales a breath that smells faintly of jasmine and rust. Inside, the corridor opens into a basin lined with bronze bowls, their lips corroded but still sharp-eyed. Coins, or so they look, lay scattered like fallen stars. Their faces have script in a language that refuses categorization, part cuneiform, part linear stroke, part something that looks suspiciously like musical notation. A conservator photographs them and insists the depressions are not made by hammering, they are impressed, as if the metals had been struck by a die pressed from a living pattern. How was such metalwork achieved, and why does its iconography refuse to conform to known alphabets? There is a comfort in classifying things, because classification lets the mind shelve a mystery and return to it. Here classification slips like fish through hands. A senior researcher traces the coin's corrosion patterns and pronounces their alloy consistent with copper mixed with a high percentage of tin, a sort of early bronze. Yet isotopic signatures point to ore sourced from two different continents, separated by seas. Trade networks can explain composites, but the arrangement of motifs on the coins suggests a deliberate hybrid iconography, an intentional blending that speaks of a culture fluent in juxtaposition. Metallurgy Analysis, 2020. At noon, heat becomes a physical pressure. The island scrub gives off resinous scents. A boy brings a bowl of stew to the team. Inside the stew, someone has tucked a small carved token. It is the same spiral, the same fork. The team laughs, then grows silent. Tokens like these turn up in unexpected corners, sewn into garments, tucked inside the knot of a fisherman's rope. Someone else whispers that the signs appear where people keep safe things. Night after night, the sea returns with small objects, a ceramic thumb ring, a polished pebble engraved with a single sigil, a shard painted with streaks of gold leaf. Each finds its way into the archaeologist's trays like evidence quietly arranging itself into implication. An ethnographer notes that older islanders hang tiny charms with similar shapes from children's necks, a prophylactic talisman against storms. They say it keeps the ocean from taking you. She translates, adding a small pronunciation note for a word that will not be taught in any language class. The more they uncover, the less certain they become of linear narratives. Rather than an original, corrected version, there seems a conversation across time. A person cuts a mark, another smooths it, a later hand fills it with pigment. The plaza was not built in a single plan but accreted like a palimpsest of rituals. Each layer preserves a different set of intentions, some civic, some private, some desperately symbolic. One morning the divers bring up a slab with a relief so worn that it looks almost illegible. In strong light, a faint relief becomes visible, a procession of figures, humans perhaps, moving toward a circular opening. At their feet, a pattern of waves is carved like metronome ticks. The figures carry objects that could be musical instruments or tools. Their faces are indistinct, but their posture is urgent. When the conservator gently brushes away a film of silt, the outline sharpens and, for an instant, something like the past seems to catch its breath. If you stood among the damp stone and the swept fish sheen, what would you say? Would you tell a story of migration, a ritual of surrender to the sea, or would you say that the engravings are an instruction, a manual turned into myth? Each reading carries consequences for how this place is protected or excavated. Each reading determines who will stand to gain knowledge and who will only have questions. Researchers propose experiments. One team wants to replicate the incisions with period-accurate tools to test wear patterns. Another suggests a non-invasive acoustic resonance test, to see whether the plaza's ring could have functioned as a resonant chamber, an instrument scoring sound as a node for ritual. If you strike the plinths in sequence, small differences in pitch appear, a hidden scale, maybe, or the consequence of materials compressed and annealed by unknown heat. When someone hums a low note, the column answers with a bell tone that seems to underline the human voice. Interviews with sailors produce small, precise memories. An old captain insists he heard singing in the fog once, a chorus that seemed to rise from the rocks and fall back into the sea. He describes the intervals of the song like a fisherman measures wind. Not a song you make with a mouth, he says. More like the sea had throat. Such testimony cannot be placed on a lab report, but it shapes the questions, like wind shaping dunes. The coins, the reliefs, the sigils, they all point toward a culture that encoded meaning into pattern and sound. But what do the patterns mean? Several scholars propose comparative approaches. Similar spirals appear in Bronze-Age pottery in an inland valley, while the three-pronged fork recalls agricultural symbolism on another island chain. An analyst cautions against superficial similarities. Patterns travel like adages, mutate as they cross hands. Yet networks of exchange in the archaeological record have always surprised later researchers by their reach. One signal of the site's importance is the careful repetition of certain designs at multiple scales. A small ceramic bowl and a massive plinth may share the same motif, scaled up or down. This suggests a symbolic grammar that applies across domains: domestic, civic, ritual. People may have learned the same symbol as a child's drawing and as a civic emblem. Such cross-scalar repetition is rare and suggests a culture that thought in nested images. An exploratory trench cuts into soft sand where the plaza meets relict shoreline. Under a laminating layer of shell and silt, organic remains appear: a charred bundle of reeds, seeds, and a small carved figure. Radiocarbon returns a date that surprises everyone, a few centuries older than the earliest pottery they had found. Suddenly the chronology shifts like a tide-pool. What they thought of as late-phase ornamentation may be an early tradition revived. Shifts like this force an uneasy humility. The sequence of layers is not always straightforward. Coastal contexts are notoriously capricious. Storms rearrange debris, tides bury and unbury. Human reuse complicates stratigraphy. In a culture that built with intention and then watched the sea take portions of that intention, the surviving record is a palimpsest with parts scraped away by both time and nature. At a lecture later, on a table littered with slides and images, a visiting scholar pauses over an image of a token. "Look at the margins," she says. "See how they planned the die." She taps a pixel enlarged to absurd scale. "These are not minted haphazardly. This is control. This is administration." Administration of what? A cult? A trading network? An economy of meaning where access to certain sigils conferred status or protection? The question circles the room like a moth. In the evenings, when the team retires to the house of the town historian, a low stone building breathing old wood and the smell of paper, conversations grow speculative. One young researcher remarks that the symbol's forked prong resembles a tuning fork. Another retorts that tuning forks are modern. A compromise emerges. Perhaps the fork was a pictogram, perhaps an instrument, perhaps a pointer. Possibility proliferates like foam on the shore. A breakthrough comes unexpectedly when a local diver finds, in a collapsed chamber, a cylinder of beaten metal containing a rolled sheet. The sheet disintegrates on exposure to air. What remains are tiny impressions, outlines, like fingerprints, pressed against the metal. Under high magnification, a pattern emerges that seems to map not words but intervals, a notation. Someone suggests it might be a schedule: tides, market days, ritual cycles. Someone else posits it could be instructions for heating, a recipe for creating the strange stone that rings. Instrumentation tries to keep up with imagination. CT scans of the metal cylinder reveal internal stratigraphy, layers within layers, but no readable ink. Laser-stimulated fluorescence lights up residues that hint at botanical oils and crushed shell. The preservation is miraculous and maddening in equal measure. pieces of a puzzle fit together not in a single tableau but as hints across mediums. Ethnographers begin collecting oral histories more systematically. An elder recounts a tale of a procession where villagers carried small, bright bowls into the water and let them float away with prayers. She says that those bowls carried the names of those who had died far from home, and placing the bowl in the current meant the sea would carry their memory forward. Whether this ritual maps directly onto the physical tokens found in the basins is unclear, but the narrative gives an emotional frame, the sea as carrier of memory. And yet, for every story that softens the mystery into myth, new anomalies poke like barnacles. One of the coins yields a trace of varnish containing a compound used in lacquer technologies far to the east. A petrographic slide shows grains of volcanic glass consistent with an island chain 2,000 kilometers away. The distribution of materials reads like a map of unexpected connections. Conservative voices in the field urge restraint. Correlations do not equal contact, they say. Similarities can be convergent evolution of idea. But the plurality of signals is hard to dismiss. Repeated motifs, traded metals, pigment sources distilled from distant shores. The place may be local in life and cosmopolitan in network. Day after day, the work is incremental, points mapped, ceramics catalogued, residues tested. The human stories accumulate alongside data. A conservator finds an earring embedded with a child's hair. A grave yields a bundle of flax and a seed pod. These intimate remnants pierce the grander narratives with a human ache. A profile emerges of a community that dealt with loss by making marks and chords, by building circles to be returned to. If the site resists closure, it also expands the story of how people relate to deep time. The island's artifacts show not simply contact or trade, but an understanding of longevity, how things endure or are intentionally sacrificed to endurance. Why make a mark meant to be drowned? Why invest labor in objects that the tide will erase? Perhaps because erasure is part of communication, messages left to the sea carry a promise of return, or a plea that the water will remember. The investigators tentatively sketch a theory. The plaza served as a liminal center, a meeting place between land and sea, living and dead, commerce and cult. Its circular form is an architectural metaphor for return. The sigils are a grammar designed to be legible at multiple scales and in multiple media. And the resonance, that bell-like quality of stone, may have been an intentional acoustic feature used when gatherings chanted or performed sound-based rituals that bound community across generations. But to label is to risk flattening complexity. For every hypothesis, evidence offers a retort. The pigment's chemistry is wrong for the proposed timeline. The acoustic frequencies align with geology rather than manufacture. The dietary remains in the graves show reliance on both sea and mountain foods, suggesting a people who are either strictly maritime nor wholly inland. The more they record, the more the site refuses to be tamed. It remains unfinished in the laboratory reports and whole and alive in oral recollections. At times, it seems less like a single place than like a method of being, an insistence on creating objects that invite the sea in and then ask the sea to remember. Night falls, and the island changes its mood. Lanterns are lit. Someone plays a reed instrument that weaves notes into the wind. Under a sky fretted with unfamiliar constellations, a chorus of frogs and waves takes up the sound. The plaza, that ring in the shallows, waits in the dark like a mouth ready to speak. Who will teach the next generation to listen? Who will translate pattern into meaning without absorbing all their imagination into the pragmatic demands of funding and publication? These are not questions for thermoluminescence to answer but for time itself. A sliver of dawn pulls itself across the harbor, and the stones take on a gray that is almost blue. The team moves like careful insects, measuring tapes, chalk, a slow, ceremonious human calculus. No one speaks above a whisper. The next discovery is a doorway half buried at the inland edge of the village, where scrub pine gives way to a wash of sand and bone. It is not monumental, a low lintel, a threshold worn by feet, and yet when they clear the mouth the air that exhales is colder than the morning, as if the passage leads not into earth but into a memory held at low temperature. They send in a camera first, thick with mud and salt, and the feed resolves into a corridor flanked by slabs and sighs with the same sinuous language of spirals and forks. Here, however, the strokes curve into loops that mirror one another, as if the engraver had been drawing sound itself within stone. Inside the corridor, the walls are smooth where the outside grain is rough. The smoothing suggests intent, time, and hands dedicated to careful finish. Someone runs a gloved finger along the groove and swears the motion stirs a faint metallic scent. In the film, the grooves make small rivers of shadow. In the film, their pattern almost reads like notation. What is notation for? A calendar? A song? An instruction for making things that should not be made twice? The question circles and multiplies. The corridor opens into a chamber circular as a shell and deep as a question. A shaft of light from a cleverly positioned aperture fractures across the floor and meets a pattern of inlaid stone, a radial mosaic of dark and light that, when the light hits it, forms an image that seems to rotate. The rotation is optical, nothing more than eye and geometry, and yet the effect is ineffable. For a moment the floor appears to be breathing. They map the geometry and find ratios precise to a fraction of a degree. The artisan who set the pattern knew how to make light obey. Laser theodolites measure arcs and return numbers that a mathematician on the team recognizes from ancient treatises on shadow casting. He says, half to himself, "This is a mathematics of performance." Photogrammetry, Site Survey, 2020. In the chamber's center lies an object like a heart, a disc of metal pitted with age but crafted with a precision that makes the conservator's hands tremble. It is not wholly corroded, certain facets reflect like eaten mirrors. Around its circumference are tiny notches that correspond to the grooves in the slab. When the notches align with the grooves, the disc seems to complete itself, as though the chamber and the object were two halves of a machine. The disc yields more than metal. Under a microscope, embedded in corrosion filaments, are traces of organic resin and microscopic plant fibers. Someone in the lab recognizes the fibers as belonging to a salt-tolerant reed used historically in ritual cordage. The combination, attuned metal disc and ritual reed fibers, suggests a hybrid of craft and ceremony. Materials Analysis, ICP-MS and FDIR, 2021. They attempt a reconstruction in a wet lab. Replicas are cast, not made to deceive but to test sound. When struck with a wooden mallet, the replica releases a tone that resonates through a bench like a remembered ocean. The sound is not merely musical, it is measured. Frequencies align with harmonic intervals that map closely to human vocal ranges. A vocalist on the team sings a low note, and the bench answers. The effect is uncanny, a room designed to carry voice, to carry memory along acoustic folds. If you stood there and sang, what would you be returning? A name? A law? A lullaby meant to soothe the living and the dead? The chamber's architecture insists on an audience. News of the chamber spreads like a scent. An institute sends a team of acousticians who lay out arrays of microphones and speak of modal analysis. Their plots show peaks at intervals suggesting that the chamber could indeed act as a resonator tuned to particular frequencies. They caution, scholarly and blunt, that acoustic properties can arise from geology as readily as from artifice. Yet their models cannot fully dislodge the sense that hands had shaped stone to sing. Acoustic Survey, 2022. A fragment of pottery from the chamber's fill bears painted notation, a set of dots and bars that echo the grooves in the stone. A musicologist learns the pattern and suggests it could encode cyclical time, perhaps a ritual calendar synchronized to tides and lunar phases. The notation is not language as we use it, it is memory in pattern. The notion is intoxicating, a culture that recorded time not in ink but in intervals of sound and in carved rhythm. Arguments in printed journals will later parse whether such patterns are symbolic or practical. For the villagers, the matter is simpler. They recall weddings where a reed instrument played notes that matched the patterns on old tokens. They hum the fragments, and the hum becomes a thread connecting now to then. In the eastern trenches, further finds complicate chronology. A set of small, well-crafted beads with a luminous glaze are found sealed beneath an older floor. The glaze contains an element rare in the region. Its signature matches deposits known from a volcanic island chain 200 miles away. One pottery shard bears a scratch not of accident but of intentionality, A hand has gouged a tiny spiral, then filled the groove with a red ochre whose radioisotope's signature points to a puree of crushed shell and plant pigment. The sequence suggests repeated acts of affirming identity. A graduate student, late and caffeinated, pores over the images and notices that the placement of spirals corresponds to the position of certain bones and burials found on the same stratigraphic horizon. She proposes a controversial idea. The spirals may mark kinship, a coded genealogy embedded not in text but in body and object. If true, the plaza ceases to be merely civic architecture and becomes a genealogy writ into public space. The thought makes the room thrum with possibility. Not all discoveries warm the heart. A developer from the mainland eyes the island with a market's thirst. He offers funds tied to exploitative permits, a boutique resort, a boutique narrative of the mystical past, curated for tourists. The villagers, some tempted by cash, others wary of commodification, are divided. The team finds itself not only excavating artifacts but negotiating futures. A heated meeting at the town hall becomes a small theater of political science. An elderly elder speaks of stewardship as a duty. "We are not owners of these things," he says slowly. "We are their keepers until the sea and the ancestors decide what to do." The developer counters with plans and renderings, with projected incomes and glossy fonts. The clash forces the archaeologists to consider ethics in real time. Who tells the story? Who benefits from it? Meanwhile, the notation problem nags at the linguists. One of them, a quiet scholar who has worked with inscriptions across 3 continents, returns from the lab with a smear of excitement. "These marks," he says, "behave like a prosodic notation. They map rhythmical stress rather than lexical items." He sketches a series of marks on a napkin and taps them as if they were beats. "Listen," he says, and when the team tries the sequence, the chamber answers with a sympathetic vibration that makes a small ring of dust dance. Could rhythm be language? In many cultures, rhythm carries memory as surely as paper. Drums encode lineage, clapping conveys directives, sound is a grammar. If the islanders had developed a prosodic script, they would have built their history to be heard as well as seen. A breakthrough occurs when a conservator extracts an impression from a fragile token and produces a negative in a synthetic resin. Under a microscope, the negative reveals micro-incisions at intervals too precise for casual marking. They correspond to known mathematical constants used in ancient timekeeping, the ratio of lunar orbit, the fraction of tidal cycles. If the incisions are indeed a calculation of time, then the islanders had engineered a notation system for cyclical prediction, a technology of patience. The reconstruction that follows is part laboratory grind and part communal storytelling. The team invites villagers to hum tunes their grandparents taught them. They record the sessions and overlay waveforms with photogrammetry, looking for coincidence. The matches are not exact, but patterns emerge. A rhythm used in lullabies recurs in the grooves. A wedding chant maps to a series of notches. The past and present begin to stitch. Yet every stitch reveals a tear. A set of bones, clearly interred with care, show signs of exposure to high heat after deposition, a practice of secondary cremation or a later conflagration. The radiocarbon sequence is messy. Dates bracket possibilities rather than present certainties. Human choices confound stratigraphy. Hearths reused, stones rearranged, rituals repeated with variation. The island will not yield a single linear tale. One afternoon, the team uncovers a small alcove lined not with stone but with a pavement of fired clay, each tile stamped with a tiny spiral. The tiles are delicate as eggshells and yet preserved in astonishing detail. Embedded in the mortar are fragments of textile, flax fibers dyed with an indigo-like blue. Under the microscope, the dye shows botanical markers consistent with indigo plants that grow both locally and in distant wetlands. Trade or independent discovery? The question returns. Conservation becomes continual triage. Salt crystals cause microfractures, humidity warps frames, every handling risks loss. The team recruits local hands and teaches careful practices, and the village school becomes a makeshift conservation lab where children learn to brush soil from pottery with soft toothbrushes. The act of conservation becomes itself a pedagogy, an expression of mutual stakeholding. At night, the island's sky is a dense theater of stars. The team maps celestial alignments in the ancient grid and finds that one axis of the plaza aligns roughly with the rising of a star that once marked a certain season 5,000 years ago. Alignments drift with precession, but the possibility holds. The plaza could encode an astronomical observation system, a public calendar for planting, for pilgrimage, for ritual return. The thought that people tuned architecture to sky and tide simultaneously sends a thrill through the researchers. It would mean an integrated cosmology, a lived understanding of the interdependence of sea and firmament. Strangest of all are the dreams people report. Several team members begin to dream of circles rolling across water, of a sound like hollow bells translating waves into syllables. At first they laugh it off, the human propensity to absorb pattern until it becomes personal. But then an elder relates that for generations, children on the island dreamt of a song of taking that called to those who left and guided them home. Whether these dreams are contagion or continuity, they are another piece of the human documentation. Academic papers will later dispute whether dream reports are evidence or anecdote. For those who live and breathe on the island, dream and data coexist. The community's memory is not an appendix to the artifacts. It is a living channel that connects the stones to the human heart. The next season brings storms that batter the exposed sections and rearrange what little silt remains. A sandbank collapses and reveals a slender object of worked bone, etched with miniature spirals, tucked into a crevice like a secret. Its survival is miraculous and fragile. When the conservator cradles it, she says softly, "This is a child's toy or a votive. Someone held this and felt the same weather as we do." The intimacy of that sentence lands like a pebble in a quiet pool. If you had to name this place now, what would you call it? A center of songs? A ledger of loss? A machine for prayer? No single name suffices. The island insists on plurality. On a clear morning, a linguist announces that a partial reading is possible. Not full translation, not yet, but recognition of a sequence as a cyclical litany, names of months, tides, market cycles, and a repeated invocation that might be a family name or a protective phrase. The words are not phonetic in the way alphabetic systems are. They are logoperiodic, each symbol carrying a bundle of temporal and social meaning. The revelation is halting and charged. They have touched, with tempered fingers, the edge of comprehension. Celebration is subdued. The team recognizes that such partial wins invite misinterpretation. A misread line could radiate through headlines and alter policy, tourism, and the community's sense of itself. To proceed responsibly means to publish carefully, to include local voices, to guard against triumphant narratives that reduce complexity to spectacle. As the season deepens, the island settles into a rhythm of work, argument, music, and cups of bitter tea. Each morning the stones return to weather, and the sea to its patient business. Each evening the village returns to stories, not always about the plaza but about children, about lost boats, about small kindnesses that accumulate into culture. The team files reports to funders and writes grant updates that compress months of nuance into prose that leans towards certainty. They invite skeptical colleagues for second opinions. They host a symposium beneath a tarpaulin where slides and debates fly like gulls. And all the while the plaza continues to hold its silence. Not a refusal but a patience that invites better questions. If you stood here and listened long enough, would the patterns yield meaning or merely inspire more listening? The question is less an interrogation and more an instruction, to attend, to gather, to be wary of comfortable narratives. The island asks for a long attention span, not the instant gratification of a headline. Night comes and the air cools. In the dark, someone hums a line of a song the elders remember, and the stones answer in a low, compliant echo that feels like an acknowledgement rather than explanation. For now, that will have to do. A wind like sandpaper moves across the exposed plaza at noon, lifting salt into a dry cry against the teeth of carved stone. The sigils throw their shadows like small suns. In the days after the chamber is logged, attention fractures into ever smaller pursuits. One team maps acoustics, another chases pigments, a third tracks isotopes like detectives following footprints through water. Each discipline brings its own language and its own certainties, and their meetings are brief and ritually civil, a choreography of specialists learning to speak one another's grammar. Under a low sky, the island yields a new secret. Beneath a collapsed hearth, in a pocket of anaerobic silt, a sealed bundle of leaves and a thin sheet of something that looks like beaten bark. When the conservator opens it under filtered light, pressed between the fibers are impressions, not words, not quite, but a series of interlocking symbols arranged in columns. The pattern repeats like a refrain and is bound by a double-lined border that the conservator calls, with a small smile, a frame for memory. Who made this catalogue, and for whom was it made? The find suggests literacy of a kind that is not merely mnemonic but portable, a thing you could carry and consult. The implication widens the island's sphere. People who kept small, bounded repositories of meaning to be carried into storms, into exile, into trade. Conservation note: anaerobic packaging preserved organics. A dense rain comes in the afternoon, and for a while the crew works beneath tarps. The sound of water on canvas mixes with the hum of a generator, and the rustle of paper as hypotheses are drafted and discarded. On a map, the distribution of finds looks almost like a constellation. Clusters of ritual objects around domestic cores, a spill of coins near a wharf, lines of post holes curving toward a former shoreline. The spatial pattern hints at division of labor, or at ritual processions, or at a topology of memory where certain places are for leaving and others for retrieval. The islanders tell a different kind of map. An elder draws a circle in the sand and marks axes with a stick. "This," she says, pointing, "is where we send the names. This is where we call them back." Local term. Namagar. Pronounced Namachgar. House of names. Dot. Her hand is sure. Her map is small, but it carries a moral claim. These places are not mere artifacts but repositories of social obligation. Lab tests complicate the comforting curves of narrative. Thermoluminescence on a burnt shard returns a date older than the charcoal from the same layer. Radiocarbon on reed fibers brackets a sequence that makes a neat lineage fray into multiple episodes of reuse. Someone jokes that the island has a habit of refusing tidy chronologies. The science is rigorous but not immune to the island's obdurate agency. The numbers insist on ambiguity rather than clean resolution. Thermoluminescence, Radiocarbon AMS, 2022. A small excavation near the wharf uncovers an assemblage of oarlocks and fragments of a hull, carbonized and bent as if by heat. The timber's growth rings are counted and cross-referenced with regional dendrochronology, revealing seasonal patterns that place the woods felling in a narrow window decades earlier than expected. The vessel's construction shows joinery techniques shared with shipwrights from another archipelago. Wood, like silver and pigment, speaks of movement, people, ideas, goods, and ritual forms traveling across water. On a quiet afternoon, the linguist returns with a list of repeated compounds appearing across inscriptions. They are not names so much as markers of relationality, kin phrases, possessive particles, terms that seem to announce status or obligation. One repeated phrase appears with small modifications when attached to different objects. Tokens sewn into clothing, stamps on storage jars. It functions like a variable in a mathematical expression, altering meaning with placement. If these inscriptions are a grammar of social life, they are not merely practical. They are performative. To mark is to bind. A school of thought arises, tentative and bold. Perhaps this place was less about a single cult than about a civic technology, an apparatus for social memory that integrated economy, ritual, and law. Coins bearing hybrid iconography might not simply be trade tokens. They could be seals of identity, permits for belonging, or talismans that granted access to communal rights. The idea reframes the ruins as infrastructure rather than only temple. Not everyone concurs. A conservative voice in the archaeological community warns against turning every artifact into an administrative tool. She points out the danger of imposing modern bureaucratic categories on people whose worldviews were different. Yet the plurality of evidence, repeated marks across domestic and public contexts, a system of symbols used at multiple scales, artifacts that appear both in graves and at marketplaces, refuses a single explanatory frame. The truth, as so often, splinters into better questions. The political economy of discovery grows sharper as permits loom and journalists sniff the air. An online outlet runs a headline about the island that sang, and the piece is framed as sensation rather than scholarship. The villagers bristle at simplification. They do not want their grief turned into a clickbait narrative. The research team responds with measured statements and a promise to co-create interpretation with community representatives. Practical collaboration ensues. A local advisory council is formed, and meetings alternate between meticulous cataloging and storytelling sessions where elders and youth exchange knowledge. These storytelling sessions reveal private histories folded into public rituals. A woman recounts how her grandmother used to carve small spirals into the soles of children's sandals to give their steps something to return to. Another recalls a tale of a ship that took a whole family and returned only a child's song, which the villagers preserved. These narratives are not neutral. They modulate how artifacts are treated, where excavations proceed, and what permissions are granted. The research begins to prioritize non-invasive approaches where possible. Ground-penetrating radar sweeps the plaza, revealing anomalies that suggest filled pits and voids like teeth in a jaw. Magnetometry highlights hearths and metal concentrations. Photogrammetric models create interactive 3D maps that villagers can inspect on tablets during public meetings, allowing a shared gaze rather than a unilateral claim. These steps do not resolve tensions entirely, but they redistribute authority. One evening, after a long day of sieving and cataloging, a junior researcher notices a recurrence of a motif carved into personal adornments, a tightly wound spiral with a three-pronged end. It appears across materials, bone, shell, metal, and across contexts, in burials, on agricultural tools, and on a ledger-like tablet. The ubiquity suggests an emblem with broad social resonance, one that crosses class and function. The motif may be the island's anchor, a symbol people invoked when they wanted to call something back into being. The team experiments with replicative archaeology to test manufacturing techniques. Under controlled conditions, they recreate small tokens, trying to reproduce the incised marks and the composite alloy mixes. The experiments reveal a surprising mastery. Artisans used quenching techniques that varied cooling rates intentionally to produce differential hardness, a practical knowledge that produced acoustic and tactile effects. The replication yields not only technical insight but aesthetic appreciation. The original makers were deliberate craftsmen with an eye for resonance. At the same time, unexpected ethical dilemmas surface. An artifact surfaced in the market in a port city and was traced back to a private collector who claimed purchase in good faith. The team must decide whether to pursue legal recovery or to negotiate a cultural exchange that might bring the piece home without antagonizing authorities. The villagers, fighting the commodification of their heritage, demand repatriation. The collector's legal counsel offers technical loopholes. The negotiation is messy and illuminates a global pattern. The circulation of antiquities is as much political as economic. Amidst these external pressures, a quieter, stranger anomaly is reported by divers: faint, regularly spaced biofilms on the undersides of certain stones. Under microscopic inspection, these films show colonies of microbes that form patterns reminiscent of the sigils. Could microorganisms colonize carved forms and, in so doing, accentuate visual motifs? The idea borders on the poetic, that life itself participates in inscription, but the scientists document the phenomenon rigorously, staining cultures and sequencing DNA. The microbiome of stone becomes a new layer of evidence, a living palimpsest that may have been manipulated or harnessed deliberately. Microbial survey, DNA barcoding. The more layers they uncover, the more the island insists upon hybrid explanations: technology and ritual, economy and magic, living processes and human contrivance weaving together. The dichotomy between practical and sacred proves brittle. People did not carve the world into such compartments. The artifacts speak in mixed registers, and the team must learn to translate with a vocabulary that allows slippage. A turning point arrives when an elder brings a worn wooden box, its lid held together by twine and a spiral carved deep into the grain. Inside are strings of small shells threaded into patterns that mirror those found in the plaza. She explains that these were used in a mourning ritual. Strings were offered to the sea with a name, and if the string returned intact it meant the name was held by the water. The practice had faded with modern life, but the boxes survived. The team records the ritual with care and, importantly, with consent. They film and archive with a policy that respects community ownership of its own images. The ritual informs interpretation. Tokens at sea may be not just offerings but working components in a practice of social memory with criteria for success and failure. A recovered token's context, found among grave goods, wedged in a rock, floating in a cove, may indicate whether the offering was returned or lost. The island's practices complicate our assumptions about intentional deposition and accidental loss. Scientific testing continues. Laser ablation sampling of metal artifacts reveals trace element ratios that hint at ore sources spanning wide geographies. Pollen analysis from sediment cores shows botanical signatures that suggest periodic contact with wetlands far to the north. A pattern emerges. The island's network was extensive, and movement was regular enough to leave botanical and metallurgical signatures. People were not isolated, they were nodes in a lattice of exchange. Yet with the lattice also comes fragility. Climate patterns, rising seas, storm surges, have shifted markedly over centuries. Coastal erosion exposes graves and deposits that have lain untouched for millennia. The team initiates emergency steps, triage excavation of at-risk contexts, relocation of particularly vulnerable artifacts to secure conservation facilities, and a public education campaign that emphasizes stewardship. The ethics of removing objects for safekeeping are debated. Does relocation safeguard or dislocate the living connection between people and place? The debate returns at night to a small kitchen where the researchers and villagers share stews and stories. One elder insists that objects must remain where they were offered. To move them is to move the prayer, she says. Another voice counters that if the sea will take the object within seasons, then moving it preserves the memory for those yet unborn. The dichotomy is profound, preservation versus contextual integrity. No easy consensus emerges. Amid administrative meetings and laboratory essays, there are secret moments of wonder. A diver surfaces with a small, bell-shaped object that fits into the palm like a miniature moon. When tapped, it emits a sound that seems to match the pitch of a carved plinth found days earlier. The coincidence is eerie not because it proves ritual usage, but because it opens a landscape of auditory imagination. Gatherings might have been orchestrated as sonic events, rituals designed to resound across water and memory. If rituals here use sound as a technology of memory, what modes of participation did they demand? Who had voice, and who listened? Did the same song bind a household as it did the polity? The questions are ethical as much as archaeological. Reconstruction of performance risks imposing modern stagecraft on intimate practices not meant for spectacle. A young archivist begins a catalog of sound alongside artifacts, recording local songs, the creak of boats, the cadence of market vendors. The archive insists that interpretation must include embodied practices, the rhythms of life that artifacts alone cannot fully capture. Sound becomes a mode of evidence, a form of data that demands new analytic tools and new humility. As the season wanes, the scientific reports become thicker and the nights fuller of argument. Yet in a small, unlit cove, an old woman and a child perform a quiet ritual. They float a tiny, painted bowl and watch it spin in the current. The child laughs when the bowl catches light. The woman traces the sigil carved on its rim with her thumb and whispers a name. The scene is ordinary and extraordinary at once, a continuity of small acts that outlast headlines and grant a kind of answer no lab can quantify. Who will inherit this knowledge? Who will be allowed to tell its stories? The island keeps its own counsel and, if anything, insists that the past is less a repository than a conversation. The team leaves that season with more data than certainty, richer in questions and poorer in closure, which, perhaps, is precisely what the place requires. A gull tears at a fish under a sky the color of old pewter, and the plaza smells of wet stone and diesel. The excavators move in a slow choreography, trowel, brush, slate, each gesture a small ceremony against the great erasures of weather and time. A narrow find in the eastern trench changes the tenor of inquiry, a folded strip of beaten copper, so thin it could have been paper, curled like an autumn leaf. When unfolded under a laminar flow hood, it reveals a pattern so compact and regular that the conservator calls it glyphic weaving, a dense lattice of strokes that are neither wholly pictorial nor clearly alphabetic. The margins of the strip bear tiny punch marks, as if the strip had been bound into a larger mechanism. What is the scale of transmission here? A personal message? A portable ledger? The artifact suggests people encoded complex information in miniatures that could travel in pockets, in bindings, or tied to garments. The notion of mobility returns again and again, memory designed to move. A cluster of jars from a collapsed storeroom yields residues that hum under chemical analysis, aromatic compounds that belong to resins used for preservation, traces of fish oils mixed with crushed seed paste, and a rare tannin extracted from a coastal shrub once used for dyeing. The blends read like recipes, practical knowledge of preservation that doubled as cultural code. Preservation itself appears ritualized. That evening, a local craftswoman, hands stained with dye and salt, brings the team a small woven pouch embroidered with spirals. Inside is a folded map drawn on palm bark, not quite a map the way an outsider understands it, but a mnemonic field, marks that a villager reads as routes to buried places, to safe houses, to offerings. She traces each line and hums the names. Her voice is an instrument that turns the map into a live pathway. The map is both cartographic and mnemonic. It situates memory within hand and song. Scientists try to quantify what the villagers already practice instinctively, a culture of distributed memory with both public nodes and private caches. GIS overlays show scatterings that align with oral routes. The archaeology is not a record imposed from above but an accretion of lived paths. The infrastructure of remembering is human-scaled, pathways, tokens, songs, and this insight reframes every isolated object as an element in a distributed network. Stratigraphy, always porous in coastal contexts, offers unpredictable hints. In one pit, a child's toy, a carved bone hummingbird, is found nested with a rusted blade and a string of beads. The association of playthings and tools complicates tidy separations between sacred and profane. The society that produced these objects seems to have allowed ritual and daily life to interweave freely, rituals embedded in chores and commerce suffused with the cadence of the divine. Linguists puzzle over the density of metaphor in inscriptions. Repeated markers act as anchors that modulate meaning rather than fix it. A single spiral carved on a doorpost may signal lineage in one context and a plea for safe passage in another. The grammar is performative and situational. Meaning is not solely in the mark but in the act of marking and the expectation of return. A different surprise arrives from the bones. Bioarchaeology reveals diet shifts that track climate pulses, a phase of intensified marine resources followed by increased reliance on upland cereals. Isotopic signatures and teeth speak of childhoods split between coast and plain. Mobility, once again, is central. People moved seasonally, maintained kin across ecatones, and bound those movements into ritual practices that use tokens and chants to maintain identity across distance. One late afternoon, a diver surfaces carrying a curious find, a small, perforated stone, smoothed to the weight of a palm, with a hole bored through the center and a faint spiral incised on one face. When threaded on a cord and swung, it produces a low, throbbing rhythm more felt than heard. The archaeologist who swings it sits very still, eyes closed, and later admits she felt as if the world had narrowed to a single pulse, a heartbeat that connected bone to tide. Objects, it seems, carry effect as much as function. The island's younger residents begin to take ownership of the narrative, in unexpected ways. A group of apprentices work with the conservators, learning to stabilize ceramics and to operate photogrammetry rigs. They produce a series of community-led maps annotated with local stories and personal recollections. In these maps, the plaza becomes not only an archaeological site but a living chronicle. The collaboration reshapes the team's methods. Interpretation becomes dialogic rather than extractive. Yet tensions simmer beneath collaboration. International media attention brings tourists who treat the village like a backdrop for selfies, disrespecting sacred spaces and pressing on fragile deposits. The Advisory Council negotiates access protocols and creates visitor pathways that minimize impact, but enforcement is a fraught labor. Conservation is not only chemical and technical, It is also social, teaching respect and establishing boundaries in a shrinking world. In the labs, microscopic surprises continue. Under scanning electron microscopes, residues on tokens show microfossils of algae and plankton species that belong to distinct marine regimes. The presence of such microfauna suggests not merely trade but seasonal movement tied to specific marine ecologies. Tokens, then, might be tied not only to people and memory but to places of harvest and particular tides. They function as credentials linked to ecological knowledge. The team's acoustic reconstructions enter a new phase of experimentation. Using 3D printed replicas and tuned mallets, they attempt to reproduce collective performances. They invite elder singers to perform while speakers and hydrophones record. The recordings reveal that certain sequences produce sympathetic resonances in the stones, a phenomenon that amplifies low-frequency notes in ways that could carry sound across water on still nights. The concept that architecture amplified voice as a means of binding community gains plausibility. Conversations in the village frequently circle back to loss of elders, of songs, of the old names for stars and coves. Some practitioners insist that part of the island's practice was designed to mitigate loss, to make absence fertile by sending tokens into circulation and by codifying names into objects that could be returned or tracked. Memory work, then, had a pragmatic aim, to ensure social continuity despite the erosions of time and tide. A legal wrinkle appears. A foreign institute proposes a long-term deposit of artifacts in a museum with superior conservation facilities. The arrangement promises preservation but at the cost of relocating objects away from their landscape. Heated debate ensues. For some villagers, the possibility of secure storage outweighs exposure to storms. For others, removal severs the lineage of care. The team mediates, but mediation cannot erase the moral question: who decides stewardship when global systems of preservation offer both protection and dislocation? At night, a child sings a fragment of a lullaby that maps to the groove patterns the linguist has tentatively read as calendar markers. The melody is simple and insistent, the kind of tune that can be taught in seconds and carried across oceans. Its alignment with material markers deepens the hypothesis that sound and sign work together as a durable memory technology. A breakthrough in materials science reframes metalwork. Microstructural analysis shows intentional alloying that produces zones of differing acoustic response within single objects. Artisans had, it appears, engineered heterogeneity to create instruments that voice complexity, a deliberate craft that married metallurgy and acoustics. The discovery elevates practical skill to artistic intention. If you had to say what mattered most in this place, would you choose permanence or adaptability? The island suggests both: objects made to be carried and remade, rituals designed to adapt to changing shores, a society that built memory into motion. The paradox is not an insoluble riddle but a cultural strategy: to embrace change while preserving identity. As the season winds down, the team drafts a stewardship plan framed by 3 commitments: protect contexts at immediate risk, co-govern interpretation with community leaders, and invest in local conservation capacity. The plan is imperfect but represents an ethic of shared responsibility. The island, meanwhile, continues its slow work: tides reclaiming, gulls nesting, children running with strings tied to painted bowls. On the final morning before winter storms, one of the apprentices teaches a small workshop in the town square on how to read the mnemonic maps. The class fills with children and a few elders who correct small details with amused grace. The circle of learners is itself an echo of the plaza's concentric forms, knowledge folded outward, then carried back inward. In that ordinary exchange, the work of archaeology shifts from extraction to transmission, and the site feels less like an object under study and more like a living teacher. A last season opens with wind that bites and a sky like old metal. The island seems to understand that endings demand a particular clarity. People move faster now, not in panic but with a narrowed focus. Rescue what will not wait, document what is fleeting, listen to stories tilted toward closure. A decisive find comes in a pebble-strewn cove where storms have scoured the sand down to pale rock. Buried shallowly, the team uncovers a wooden chest sealed with a rope of woven reed, its timbers swollen but intact. Inside lies a compact library of objects packed with care: small carved tablets, folded strips of beaten copper, a handful of polished tokens, and a long, coiled reed with notches worn by thumb. The assemblage is not random, it is curated, as if someone meant these things to travel together and to be found by careful hands. The chest is a concentrated voice from the past. Conservation note: anaerobic preservation, 2025. They bring the chest ashore and set it on tarpaulins beneath a tarpaulin tent where the light is controlled and the hum of the generator steady. The conservator works with a practiced tenderness, teasing apart bundles with scalpels, photographing detail, and stabilizing fragile fibers. Each object seems to hum with relational meaning: tokens that match glyphic lattices, a tablet with grooves that mirror the chamber's acoustics, a reed whose notches correspond numerically to the disk's circumferential marks. The corpus feels like a manual assembled for transport, a kit for memory. A linguist, who has lived on the island through 2 summers and a dozen nights of argument, sits long with the tablets. Her eyes move from groove to groove, and slowly, with a hush in the tent, a tentative thread stitches itself. The marks, she says softly, do not map to sentences as an alphabet would, they map rituals, procedures for action that include names, times, and modes of performance. One column seems to read as a funeral rite: list of names, a sequence of reed blows, a set of offerings to be floated at a precise tidal hour. Another appears to be a ledger of obligations: who owes what to whom, recorded in tokens rather than ink. The interpretation is not translation, it is functional decoding. Linguistic analysis, pattern recognition, 2025. The revelation reframes the site again. The plaza and its associated artifacts become not merely places of symbol but infrastructure for social reproduction, a portable means to carry law, ritual, and identity across distance. The tokens were not only offerings, they were receipts, signatures, and acoustic passwords. The community had created a material grammar that could be born, exchanged, and enacted to sustain ties when people were far apart or when the sea demanded separation. A plan emerges, painstaking and collaborative. The team will publish carefully, with local partners named on every paper. Conservation facilities will be upgraded on the island. A rotating caretaking fund will be established to support local stewards. Contested pieces will be negotiated for repatriation with a mix of legal rigor and cultural diplomacy. The developer's resort proposal is reworked into a sensitive stewardship program where visitor access funds conservation and where a local trust governs interpretation. It is not a perfect solution, but it is a compromise rooted in recognition that heritage must be held with communities, not merely for them. Public ceremonies follow. The community and the research team stage a modest rite at the plaza's edge. Elders and youth lay tokens in a practice sequence, sing matching fragments that have been pieced together from field recordings, and set small bowls afloat at a measured hour when the tide's lift will carry them beyond the breakers. The ritual is both homage and rehearsal, an enactment of continuity that acknowledges loss while insisting on return. The sound of reeds, the slap of oars, and the low answering bell of stone make a living knot tying past to present. Conservation proceeds with unusual care. Rather than remove every vulnerable object, the team invests in situ stabilization, temporary shelters, desalination baths on shore, and community training so villagers can tend fragile contexts between field seasons. A decision is made to leave certain offerings in place, wrapped and recorded, because for some practices the site itself is part of the pledge. Preservation is pluralized. Some objects will be moved to climate-controlled stores. Others will remain as offerings, their fate decided by the living descendants who hold them dear. Academic publication follows both restraint and generosity. Preliminary reports outline methods and invite peer review, emphasizing interdisciplinary evidence, acoustics that show tuned resonance, metallurgy indicating engineered alloys, isotopic data mapping networked exchange, microbe patterns suggesting biological participation in inscription. The most load-bearing claims are presented carefully and annotated with explicit caveats. These are models and interpretations, not final adjudications. The Community Council insists on a companion booklet in the local language that records oral histories. Both documents circulate together, a protocol for shared knowledge. As understanding deepens, the island's mysteries do not vanish so much as transform. The notation system, decoded as procedural memory, clarifies function but does not erase wonder. Rituals recorded as sequences of reed blows and token exchanges translate technical function into emotive practice. Knowing the steps of a rite does not make its meaning trivial. It reveals how people built resilience into ceremony, how a song, a token, and a time tide could knit families across absence. Yet anomalies remain stubborn. A subset of glyphic marks resists any neat reading. Their repetition appears in patterns that do not map to procedure, time, or transaction. These glyphs cluster on immovable plinths and on small votive tokens alike, a motif that seems deliberately opaque, perhaps intended only for those initiated into a particular knowledge. The team respects a boundary. Certain signs are treated as privileged knowledge, their meanings entrusted to community custodians who request discretion. Not all mysteries are for publication. The island's acoustic experiments culminate in a public performance that is both research demonstration and communal revival. Using replicas and carefully placed microphones, elder singers and children together perform sequences derived from tablets, while hydrophones in the water measure transmission. The data are recorded, analyzed, and then shared with the village as a gift, a map soundscape showing how voices and stones co-created space. For the participants, the performance is less about proving a hypothesis and more about reclaiming an embodied past. Economics remain complex. Tourism returns, but under new rules, guided routes, visitor education, and revenue sharing with the local trust. Some villagers open modest ghost houses that teach visitors to respect sites rather than merely photograph them. The developer who once pushed a resort becomes a funder for a conservation training program after negotiations that bind his investment to local governance. These arrangements do not erase inequalities, but they reframe them in terms of co-determination. In the final months of fieldwork, the team compiles a composite narrative, not a tidy chronology but a tapestry of practices. They describe a people who invented a hybrid of acoustic architecture and portable notation to hold memory across sea and storms, who used material tokens as legal and ritual instruments, who maintained networks of exchange across broad geographies, who embedded social obligations into objects designed to be carried and returned. Above all, they describe a cultural logic that embraced loss as a reality and turned the act of sending, of offering into a technology of hope. The community decides on a modest museum space where conserved objects will be stored and displayed, curated by local stewards trained by the conservators. But the main hall is not a shrine to the past, it is a workshop for living practice, a place where reed making, token crafting, and story singing are taught to a new generation. The museum's final wall carries no definitive history but a living map, updated as children add songs and names and as new findings refine understanding. Heritage thus becomes not a fossil but a conversation. The research team leaves the island with gratitude and with a studied humility. Papers and datasets go into public repositories. Audiovisual archives are deposited under community control. Legal agreements ensure objects' eventual repatriation or joint stewardship. The island remains, as it always was, both a site of material traces and a set of relationships that cannot be fully captured in graphs and scans. If you stood at the plaza the last morning, you might feel that the stones had softened rather than surrendered. The sigils remain, their grooves full of salt and memory. The disc and the reed rest in cases, preserved for future hands. The chest is catalogued and its contents studied. The song is sung again by a child who learned it from an elder and then changed it slightly, as all living songs do. Perhaps no final answer arrives, but perhaps the ending matters less than the work of tending questions. The epilogue of fieldwork is rarely a neat finish, it is a set of beginnings sleepwalked into being. Months later, the team reconvenes for a symposium where data and stories are presented across screens, and where elders read aloud the community booklet in the local language while researchers listen in translated hush. The room vibrates with a shared responsibility, to know without owning, to preserve without displacing. In a lecture hall, a young scientist who had been skeptical now confesses a change of mind. "I came believing artifacts were objects to be classified," she says, "and I leave believing they are instruments that were used to carry people through absence." The confession is not an abandonment of method but an enlargement of purpose. Archaeology as care work. Scholars publish cautious pieces that emphasize method, uncertainty, and the ethical frameworks developed in partnership with community members. Acoustic papers describe resonance patterns and propose models for performance. Chemists publish alloy analyses. Linguists map procedural notations and suggest comparative frameworks for prosodic scripts. Each discipline hedges its claims and invites further testing. In footnotes and appendices, the team includes oral testimonies and local interpretations as primary evidence, insisting that scholarly narratives must include the voices of those whose landscape and memory were studied. The island's story ripples outward. Other coastal communities, hearing of the project's approach, contact the research consortium asking for similar support in documenting vulnerable sites. The methods developed: community co-curation, in situ conservation, portable notation decoding, become templates rather than recipes, adaptable to local needs and sensitivities. The project's legacy thus multiplies. The approach is as significant as the specific discoveries. Not every question is answered. Some glyphs remain unread. Some materials resist sourcing. Some patterns of trade defy neat geographic explanation. But the unresolved edges are no longer mere gaps in knowledge. They are invitations to future research, to partnerships, to the patient work of listening. The island's mysteries continue to pulse, but now they do so inside a framework that values local authority and long-term stewardship as much as discovery. Back on the island, seasons turn. Children who learn to measure and map become apprentice conservators. Elders teach reed-making in the museum's workshop while researchers return as friends and collaborators rather than proprietors. The plaza remains an active place, a site for new rituals, for community gatherings, for teaching and for mourning. The past and present braid in daily life. One late afternoon, an old woman who had been a keeper of names dies. The community gathers and performs a rite reconstructed from the tablets. Names recited, tokens floated, chants sung at a precise tidal hour. The ritual is both old and made new, a repair in the social fabric that honors continuity. The stones answer with a low bell tone as the reed's sound folds into the water. No scientist writes the measure of the bell in that sacred hour. The moment belongs to those who sang and to those who listened. Finally, the question that has shadowed the entire project returns with gentleness. What do we owe to the past when the future is precarious? The island offers an answer not in a single sentence but in a practice. To remember by making, by sharing, and by building institutions that can hold memory across generations. The people of the island and the scholars who worked alongside them create not a static archive but a breathing system, songs taught in schools, tokens made for living ceremonies, and a legal structure that ties stewardship to community agency. In the end, the greatest mystery may not be a puzzle with a single solution, but a human capacity to weave meaning from what the sea returns. The sigils and discs and tokens taught us that memory can be portable, that societies can engineer practices to survive absence, and that sound and object together can hold law and love across distance. The island did not surrender a final secret. It shared a method, an ethic of remembering that requires skill, ritual, and the willingness to let meanings be plural. If you leave the island, the last image that stays is not a solved map or a clean timeline but a child's hand, mud on the knuckles, eyes bright, threading a shell onto a cord and humming an imperfect song that borrows a phrase from an elder and adds a new turn. That act, small and stubborn, enacts the island's true answer. Memory is not merely kept, it is made anew each time someone remembers. The sea keeps its own calendar. Storms come and go. Tides erase and reveal with the indifferent patience of geology and weather. The stones at the plaza keep wearing their sigils into softer shapes, and the palms and reeds grow taller, and then are cut for cordage. The cycle continues. What remained in the final accounting was less a solved mystery than a reconfigured relationship between researchers and communities, between data and story, and between the living and their ancestors. The project's significance was not only in the objects recovered but in the methods forged, methods that insisted on shared authority, on non-extractive practice, and on humility before the complexities of human life. The island taught, quietly, that technology and ritual need not be opposed. The makers of that place engineered alloys and tuned soundscapes. They also sang and floated bowls and taught children to remember. Their hybrid practices were pragmatic responses to environmental uncertainty, systems that married material craft and ceremonial enactment to make social continuity possible. Lessons extended beyond archaeology. Conservation became a local practice and a shared economy. Museums reframed as workshops. Academics learned to publish with restraint, to foreground community voices, and to design research that benefits the living descendants of the past. As years pass, additional expeditions bring more data, more refined methods, and deeper partnerships. Yet each return to the plaza yields the same patient counsel: ask better questions, listen more closely, allow the people who live with the land to set the terms of knowledge. The island resists ownership by any single narrative. It prefers to be known as a chorus. Perhaps the greatest legacy is this: the ripple effects of care. Elsewhere, communities facing similar threats adopt shared governance models inspired by the island's experience. Archaeology becomes not only a science of the past but a practice in service of present-tense justice, ensuring that the people who inherit landscapes also inherit the right to interpret, to steward, and to perform the rituals that make those landscapes meaningful. No final secret emerges to crown the story. The unread glyphs remain, waiting for someone with patience, permission, and a willing ear. The coins still hint at networks whose full geography remains to be mapped. The microbes that embellish the stones continue their quiet, patterned life. But the story has a resolution of a different sort, a decision to hold mystery with care, to let unanswered questions guide future work rather than embarrass it. If you stood once more at the water's edge and asked the island for a single truth, it might offer this: that human communities invent technologies of memory that are as much social as they are material, and that these technologies survive when hands teach hands, when songs are sung, and when objects are treated not as trophies but as instruments in a living practice. So ends this chapter of listening. The stones remain. The sigils wait for more ears. The sea keeps its slow counsel, and new hands will learn to sing in time with its tides.